Today, we're going to continue our discussion of media influence on how we feel about our bodies and ourselves, specifically social media and the process of social comparison. But before we dive into that, I want to dial it back and talk about self-esteem, where it comes from, how we begin to know about ourselves from a very early age, and all of the different factors, and not just media, that influence how we feel about ourselves. So this is the point in our summer session where I like to remind you, you are so much more than. You're more than your body image. You're more than the grade you got on the last quiz. You're more than the fight that you had with your significant other. A lot of times it's so easy for us to get wrapped up in the little things in day-to-day life that just sometimes bring us down. And so I'm hoping that after today's lecture, you are reminded that there are many aspects of you. And just because you're having a bad time in one particular area right now doesn't mean that it's all bad. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox. So who am I? So when we're born, the world is this beautiful, wonderful place, and we're filled with awe. And we spend several years just trying to learn how to navigate our world. We walk, we talk, we crawl, we learn who people are, who we are. That's really one of the early goals in life, is trying to figure out, who am I? So the self-concept is the cognitive piece of really understanding who you are. And that's built from our beliefs, our self-knowledge, how you can explain your own behavior. And a lot of that is learned very early on from just observing your own behavior in different situations and how people react to you, or you interact with people or things, and learning about yourself in the process. We have our social self, which is our ability to interact with other people and learn from the roles that we have in our society and in our environment. And then we have our feelings about ourselves, or our self-esteem. So we think that the self actually begins to develop very early on in life. It's really hard to pinpoint at what point we have a sense of self, because you can't just ask a newborn, do you know who you are, and get an answer that one might understand. And so when we think about developing the sense of self, there's kind of two early markers. So from a developmental perspective, if you've taken one of the developmental course series, you may have heard about the Rouge test. And so from a developmental perspective, the idea is that by 12 to 18 months, so 1 to 1.5 years old, children begin to recognize themselves in the mirror. So they call this the Rouge test, dating back to the 70s when they first started using it. We don't call it Rouge anymore, we call it blush. But the idea is you take something that's washable and you stick it on the tip of a child's nose in a very nonchalant fashion, and you stick them in front of a mirror. If they're under 12 to 18 months of age, they point and they laugh and they giggle and they think it's hilarious that the baby in the mirror has something on its nose, because they don't realize that that baby is them. But around 12 to 18 months, the first thing they begin to do is immediately, when you set them in front of that mirror, wipe their nose. Wipe the thing off their nose. So they've begun to understand that that is them in the mirror. And so that's kind of the first marker of self-awareness that developmental psychologists have been able to identify. And then as children become more verbal, they're able to further develop their sense of self. And if you ask a child between age 3 and 5, who are you? They're going to start to be able to give you an answer. It may be a very simplistic answer compared to what you might give, but they have a knowledge of who they are, and they can actually begin to verbalize that knowledge. Now, a couple of caveats for this. So first of all, the more self-aware we are, the better we tend to behave. We become self-conscious, and we generally see ourselves as others see us. Some say that we're our own worst critic, and I think for a lot of people that that's true. But if we describe ourselves, if I just ask you who you are, and I ask you to write down 20 things, and I ask someone that knew you, a classmate, um, a friend, a family member, who you were, and had them write down 20 things, there'd be a fair amount of match between those, the way that you describe yourself and the way that others would describe you. So we generally see ourselves as others see us. So when we talk about the self-concept, we break that further down into the way we see ourselves, our self-image, into, again, our feelings about ourselves, our self-esteem. And then there's that ideal self, the way we wish that we were. And that's often where this concept of social comparison comes in. It's this notion that we use other people as a marker for how we think we should be. And we may use them even for information on how to get to that ideal self. So when we think about the self-concept and the ideal self, we have to think about all of the different aspects of ourselves. It's Calvin and Hobbes. I love this, so I stuck this in here. Bad grades, lowering my self-esteem. Your denial of my victimhood is lowering my self-esteem. I just love Calvin. Anyway, had to leave that in there. So academics are one portion of our self-concept, and that informs, again, our self-esteem, especially if you tie a lot of value in who you think you are to the grades that you get. So what is self-esteem? Self-esteem is the way that we see and we think about ourselves. It's a measure of how much you value, respect, and feel confident about yourself. And it's made up of all of the experiences, interpersonal relationships that you've had ever in your life. And so self-esteem is continually evolving and changing as we evolve and change and have more experiences. So there's a sense of stable self-esteem, kind of you know who you are and you have feelings about who you are, like, dislike, neutral. And so when we talk about general or global self-esteem, that's what we're talking about. However, there are also aspects of self-esteem that may vary on a day-to-day basis, just depending on what's going on. So we have academic self-esteem. So like Calvin and Hobbes, if your grades are really part of who you are, then if you get a poor grade, your self-esteem is going to take a momentary hit. There's our social self-esteem. So if you're a social butterfly and you like to be around other people, you're very extroverted, the COVID pandemic may have been really, really challenging for you if you had to self-isolate and not be able to be with friends and family like you normally would. We have our physical self-esteem. This can be body appearance self-esteem. It could also be performance-related self-esteem. So like if you're an athlete, maybe your self-esteem takes a hit if you don't do as well in a race or a competition as you thought you were going to. Technological self-esteem, that's becoming a thing. So how good you are with various mobile devices. If you're a GIM major, your games is your major, then this is probably a really big part of your self-esteem. Artistic self-esteem, if you're someone who likes to draw or paint or dance or however you like to express yourself, that may be a part of your self-esteem. And there are many, many other aspects of how we define ourselves. So that's why I started this lecture saying you are so much more than, because there are so many different aspects of who you are. So how is our self-esteem affected by those we surround ourselves by? And I'm talking about in person and online. So social comparison theory is wonderful when we're growing up because it's how we learn who we are. It's how babies first begin to realize that they are someone separate from mom and dad and brother and sister and grandma and babysitter and nanny or whoever they may have been around. The problem is that as we grow up, we begin to, again, use that as a marker to help us reach our ideal self, which is not inherently bad. But if we begin to continually try to exceed the mark of who we are, and we're never satisfied with who we are, then that can really sometimes have a negative impact on us. So our social comparison argues that self-esteem is affected by our sense of belonging, our feelings of fit in our environment, our own self-evaluation, again, of all those different areas, our decision-making process, inspiration, regulating emotions and well-being. There's so many things that that we can use when we're talking about other people and how they can affect us, right? So other people can be a benchmark for us, which again can be good if it helps us get closer to that ideal self, but it can also be bad if we're constantly comparing ourselves to others and feeling like we're not good enough. So there's two main kinds of social comparison. We have upward social comparison, which we use for inspiration and motivation. When we're trying to have a role model, right? And we want to be like that role model, or we have a boss and they're apprenticing us to learn how to do the job. That's upward social comparison. We're learning from them, we're inspired, we're motivated. However, again, sometimes it can make you feel inadequate if you constantly feel like you're never meeting the mark, and end up making you feel bad about yourself and affect your overall kind of negative moods or negative affect. We have downward social comparison. And this tends to be, again, it can be good or it can be bad. It tends to be when you compare yourselves favorably to other people. So you feel like you're better than somebody else. It's downward social comparison. And typically that makes you feel better about yourself. You're more fortunate, more grateful, which can be a good thing. But in a bad situation, this is also bullying, right? Where we feel better than other people and we actually put them down to make ourselves feel better. So again, good and bad sides to both kinds of social comparison. It all depends on how you use it. So social media, I could and have actually taught a whole class on social media and how it affects us. So I'm going to try to really boil that down to just a little nutshell. So social networking sites, I love this quote, provide the perfect platform for meticulous self-presentation by allowing users to select content on their profiles, post pictures, and represent themselves in ideal ways. So when we talk about social media, for the most part, what you see out there is what we call the highlight reel. So people don't share everything. They typically share the good stuff. They got a good grade, they graduated, they went on vacation, they like what they look like today. They just got a promotion, whatever it is. Like, we don't tend to share the really bad stuff. And so that gives other people an unrealistic perception of who we are because they only see the good. And so if you're comparing yourself to someone on social media, it could be friend, family, celebrity, whoever it may be, realize that what you're seeing is only part of the story. You're just probably seeing the highlight reel. So I'm going to talk about Facebook because Facebook has had the most research done on it because it's been around the longest. But know that the same is true of Instagram, the same is true of Snapchat, Twitter to some extent, less research on TikTok because it's so new. But what I'm saying about Facebook has been found on other social media platforms. Okay, so Facebook users, Instagram users, etc., believe that other users are happier and more successful than they are because they're looking at the highlight reel, and that upward social comparison makes them feel bad because they don't feel like they're good enough. Someone with a really active social network, lots of comments and likes, is usually perceived as upward social comparison target in terms of popularity, sociability, and perceived social capital. And again, that can be good if you're using them as a role model to improve yourself, but also bad if you always feel like you're never good enough. So it depends on how you do that. 88% of people engage in making social comparisons on Facebook. Again, similar numbers for Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, etc. And 98% of those comparisons are upward social comparisons. So we're finding celebrities, people we admire, we're following their accounts, and we're comparing ourselves to them in an effort to try to be more like them. Again, that can be good, but it also can be very detrimental. So there's a strong relationship between social media and self-esteem, where increase in social media usage causes self-esteem of individuals to actually decrease. 1 hour spent on Facebook, somebody studied this, is phenomenal to me, spent a 5.574 point decrease in self-esteem score of an individual. So buyer beware is my point here. If you're going to be on social media, be careful who you follow, and be careful how you're using it, and be careful how much time you're spending on it. So the more research we've done, the more we've found that it's not necessarily about time as much as it is about the activities that you're doing. So if you're spending a lot of time comparing yourself and you're feeling bad after you have been on social media, get off of social media. So in my social media class I taught last summer, I actually had students do a social media ban for 24 hours just to see how they felt. And every single one of them said they felt better about themselves. So just something to think about. If you're finding that when you get off of social media, you feel bad, maybe spend less time on it or change how you're utilizing it.